Bradbury Building is something I've known about long before I came to Los Angeles, but it really wasn't until I got here that I really understood how it connected not with just the history of this city, but with the history of the United States in some really profound ways. To me, what's really important about this building is seeing it in context of the time when it was built. So this building is 1893. You go back to the year 1890, and there's a fellow named Edward Bellamy. He writes a book called Looking Backward, which sold more copies than any book in the United States. It launched a national political movement called Bellamy Clubs, started a political movement called nationalism, which is sort of, after about 10 years, kind of fell apart and sort of moved into the labor union and socialism. But it really was responding to a period of our history when there was a big gap in incomes, and people felt that the sort of robber barons of industry, rightly so, were getting all of the rewards, and there was a lot of poverty within the rest of the country. So he put that to one side. And then, interesting connection, he's got a cousin, so he's in Boston, all right? The book Looking Backwards is about a guy who falls asleep and wakes up 100 years later in the year 2000 and tells the story of what it's like to be in the United States, 100 years in the future in the year 2000. And it predicts a lot of things that actually came true, things like telephones and credit cards, and it also, interestingly, describes what the office building of the future will look like, and it describes the Bradbury Building. Louis Bradbury was born in Bangor, Maine, but he made his fortune, and a huge fortune, in Mexico, silver mining. And after he had amassed that fortune, he moved with his wife and family to Los Angeles and decided that he ought to have an office building close to his home in Bunker Hill. That was the day when Bunker Hill had homes on it, not high-rise office buildings. And so he went to a local architect, Sumner Hunt, and asked him to design a building that would really mark his legacy and the legacy of the Bradbury family forever. And Sumner Hunt turned in the design for this building, but an odd thing happened, and historians don't know what happened actually. But Sumner Hunt was fired, and Louis Bradbury went to Sumner Hunt's draftsman, who was getting paid about $15 a week, and said to Mark Wyman, "I want you to finish this building for me and be the architect of record." And Mark Wyman said, "No, I don't think I can do that." And then he went home with his wife, and they pulled out something called a planchette board, which is kind of like a Ouija board. It's a thing that you move around. It has a little clamp that holds a pen on it, and supposedly the spirits of the afterlife will guide your hands, and you'll get messages from another world. And they got a message that said, "Mark Wyman, take the commission, and you will be," and then it was an unintelligible word was scribbled on the paper, and they looked at it, and they looked at it, and suddenly they turned it upside down, and it spelled out successful. And so he called up, or he didn't call up because there were telephones, but he went back to Louis Bradbury and said, "Okay, I'll do it." And that's the story of why there are two architects associated with this building. I think it's interesting to make a comparison between this building and what Apple is doing in Cupertino right now. Both buildings the Apple headquarters is at an outrageous cost of the day at over $5 billion. This building was $500,000 when it was built, an equally staggering sum of money. Now, what's also interesting is that they both use very cutting-edge technology. Right now today, the sheets of glass that are about 12 by 44 feet that are going into the Apple headquarters are the largest sheets of glass ever put on a commercial office building anywhere in the world. When this building was built, these windows had the largest sheets of plate glass anywhere on the West Coast. So while in our sensibilities today we might look at this and think it's a traditional exterior, this was a highly modern building to everybody at the times. The other thing is that this building has 2 elevators. I don't know that there was an elevator in Los Angeles at the time that these were built. There was no electricity for these elevators. There were 2 massive steam engines, one on either side of each elevator, that were probably burned coal that powered the elevators up and down. And the other thing is, think about the technology. Those wrought iron banisters on the inside, which look kind of quaint and decorative to us today. Wrought iron was just coming into fruition around that time. It was the Eiffel Tower, built about 3 years before out of cast iron, that started this process. All the balustrades, all the decorative ironwork on this building was made in France. It was shipped to the Columbia Exposition in Chicago, put on display for a year, then came out here to be put in this building. So there are all kinds of rich technological advancements in this building that now we look back and we hardly think about, but at the time were absolutely mind-blowing to the people who looked at it. I think the quality of space of the atrium is interesting in that it's something that was a new idea of the future 100 and some years ago, and now the idea of natural light, daylight, are things that we are experimenting with all the time. So for that reason, I think the building is very much ahead of its time. The other thing that's, I think, why people react to the building the way they do is it really creates a social environment with the atrium. All the offices have this sort of little neighborhood inside where the tenants get to see one another, they interact with one another going up and down the stairs, and it creates I think a very pleasant environment that somehow connects with the human spirit. And that's why I think for more than 100 years now, this building is so popular, and that's why tour groups continue to come through this building day after day after day from all around the world.
So I've discovered this space for myself when I was working up on Bunker Hill and parked on the other side of the 110, and in order to get to work I had to cross through this building and find my way through. And when doing so, I realized that it had a lot of interesting spatial qualities to it. I was actually fascinated by this labyrinthic character of it. It reminded me of Piranesi's prison drawings, where one feels a little bit lost inside. And it actually did take a while for me to find the right and shortest path through it. It's quite interesting trying to enter this building as well. On the street level, it's rather hermetically sealed. It's very hard to find your entrance and penetrate it. And once you're inside, it's very hard to find your way out. Because of this labyrinthic character where all sides are very similar, one feels somewhat locked in. There's a sense of disorientation and lostness. It's interesting that the signage people had to come up with different colors for each of these towers. That helps a little bit to know where you are. Maybe we can hear it right now in the sound, I'm not sure, but the acoustic quality is another one that I found fascinating, because there's this echoing, there's a depth to it. It's almost like a Gothic cathedral in a way, where one can hear things way back, way far away. They're somewhat echoing. I can't clearly understand them, but they are there. So there's this sound layering that's happening here, which I find interesting. So there are these cutouts between these different levels, and one gets view angles that really penetrate 6th floor at a time, different towers going up in between. So there's this visual layering, which is quite fascinating. The actual surfaces and the feel of it is dated, and I would love to get a shot at renovating this place. It's a lot of tacky surfaces, and one can see that the retail spaces on the inside have a very hard time to survive because they are totally disconnected from the city. So that's a very questionable setup or layout. But I think if one could find a way to reconnect it to the city grid, it could be a really interesting space that would actually make the fabric of the city richer. But as it is right now, it's completely sealed from the city. I guess that was the intention to some degree, to really focus onto the inside, and maybe at some point that was somewhat appropriate in downtown LA when it was purely commuter town. There was nothing going on in the streets. That has changed, so now it feels like a real oddball in downtown. I mean, I mentioned earlier, this is for me a building with a lot of contradiction. It's not a clean cut, so it's not a master example of design excellence, but it can help with all its failures to think about better buildings. So I think the failure here is really the disconnect to the city and its complete inward orientation. But then it's seductive in that interior life. So it's an interesting contradiction with this building. So one can learn from its positives, I think, here, but also from its negatives, because it's so clear that it has a lot of flaws. So what I like is this layered aspect. So for example, right now I'm looking up several layers and I see the sun being reflected on one of these glass towers up above. So I'm personally not hit by the sun. It doesn't come down here, but it's way up there. That's again this kind of Piranesi romantic view of it. In terms of finishes, I do like the concrete work in here, but that's about it. I mean, everything else needs to come out and be redone. But I think once one would place in quality materials and have an interesting concept for the interior space, it could be a really exciting experience in here. So the question about its situation in the urbanism is interesting. I think maybe at some point, or when it was built, which was in 1976, the idea was that the city would consist of special places that would be connected through these sky bridges, and the traffic would be on the ground level and the pedestrian experience would be disconnected from it, but maybe also not bothered by it. The idea of meandering through the city without being impacted by vehicular traffic might have been appealing at some point. By now we know that it's not working that well, that it's actually good to be on the street level and negotiate the space with these other means of transportation, buses and cars and so on. It makes for a lively city. So it's a richer experience to be on the ground. In that sense, I think it's probably a failed utopia. And that's why I think we need definitely a shot at this building to open it up to the city and change that.
Building was really driven by two competing visions. There was a vision from the university and a vision from the Annenberg School, from the faculty and the leadership in the school. The university wanted a building which would blend with their campus, which is collegiate Romanesque, and they wanted to change that and do collegiate Gothic. And it was very much a formal kind of thing. There wasn't an idea behind it. It was a look they were after. The Annenberg School, on the other hand, had an idea. It was really about finding an image for the idea, and the idea was a school that promoted interconnections between students, between faculty, and between disciplines, that really felt that it encouraged a free flow of ideas between all the folks in the school, a school that was welcoming, and promoted all this free thinking. And they used words like visually accessible, transparent spaces. The dean was fond of saying he didn't want spaces that contained, he wanted spaces that connected. And that was kind of all they had. They went on at length to expound on that, but at the end of the day, those were the core ideas. So the trick was how to get these two competing visions to work in the building. So we really thought of the building almost as, try to imagine an old Gothic building built in the 11th or 12th century, which became underutilized in the 21st century and was bought by a new educational institution, and they wanted to transform it into a 21st century school project. So we imagined this as an old building that was getting repurposed. So in that context, you would have an existing Gothic shell, and inside that shell you'd have a brand new, completely state-of-the-art functioning building. So that's kind of what we wanted to do. We were looking for the juxtaposition. Initially we wanted to have stuff from the outside, some of that Gothic look kind of leak inside the building, and some of the modernity and contemporary things leak out, so there'd be kind of this blend between the two, but that really wasn't acceptable to the university. So everything really happens on the inside, and it's really a contemporary building which really tried to give a form to the ideas of the school, and at the same time juxtapose that with at least some vestiges of the historic aspects. And you see that in the use of colored glass, which alludes to the stained glass. We have patterned glass, which provides privacy to classrooms and conference spaces, which alludes to the tracery. You can see the tracery through the glazing of the building. We actually separate the glazing from the tracery, so they're really seen as two separate entities. So from the outside, you see a Gothic tracery and all this heavy precast formwork. On the inside, you see all that through a layer of glass, almost as if it's a museum set piece. You're looking at a relic that's been framed, in this case by a window. Inside the atrium, I guess there were two spatial components. There was the atrium proper, which really encompasses the whole space, but the ground floor of the space was called the forum. This came specifically from the dean. He wanted the space to feel like the atrium at the Kennedy School at Harvard University, which we visited and looked at, and it's a very tight space, quite different from this. I mean, this is a 4-story high space. The Kennedy School is a 2-story high space. It's much compressed. It's small enough so that when you're giving a lecture, which is what he liked about it, there were people really close to the stage. It was really crammed full of students and faculty, and it felt very intimate. So the goal here was to try and make this 4-story volume intimate during a lecture or a presentation. And we did that by compressing the volume of the atrium, making the landings at each floor larger and the space of the atrium a bit smaller. And although we have a high floor to floor, we introduced a catwalk in between the first and the second floor, which was part of the stair. So you'd walk up a small flight to the catwalk, walk across the catwalk, and then up to the second floor. So the catwalk really effectively reduced the scale of the space. So when there's an event here, there's not only people sitting in front of the stage in the audience, but they're also hanging out on the catwalk, very close to the speaker, very close to the audience, and then they're also hanging out and watching just above that on the second floor, and then from the third and fourth floor, there's various tiers of seating. So it was a bit analogous to that, and somewhat analogous to what was the name of Shakespeare's theater? The Old Vic, was that it? I don't know, maybe that's the wrong name. But we used that as a prototype anyway, as a way of stacking the audience overlooking the speaker. So he felt compressed and intimate and hopefully not too overwhelmed. So the dean, it was exactly what the dean was looking for. He was very pleased from the get-go. Well, I think excellent design varies with various perspectives, with different perspectives. I think there's, for me, and talking about this project, there's a number of things which is it excellent design? I think so. But even excellent design has plenty of flaws, and this certainly has its flaws. But I don't think excellent design has to be perfect, but it has to succeed on different levels. It's not just a one-shot thing. And I think this succeeded on many levels. It succeeded personally because it was really the best experience with a client I have ever had, or frankly ever hope to have in architecture. It was just a joy to work on this project with this client. If it could have gone on forever, that would have been fine with me. Yeah. I knew it was a one-of-a-kind experience, and it went on for a long time, and it was very rewarding. They were the best clients for me I could possibly imagine. They were passionate, they were critical, they praised us, and they pushed us. And their input made everything better. And it was their idea, it was their vision, we made form out of it. And then we went back and forth with all that, and at the end of the day, we both owned it. And what could be better? I mean, it's their building, and it feels like their building, and they know they couldn't have made it without us. So it's our building too, which is a pretty good feeling. And they are as happy, they enjoyed the process, and they are as happy now, a couple of years in, as they were from the moment it opened. I mean, they just can't believe it's really their building. And they shower praise and love upon me every time I come here, so it's fun. I think it's very successful because of the students, because it's extremely active and interactive, which was really the goal of the whole thing. And the spaces work just like they were intended to. Where the walls are transparent in a conference room, for instance, it provides privacy to the inhabitants of the room, but it promotes curiosity from those outside, because they see something's going on, but they can't quite figure out what it is, and they want to go in, and if not that room, they want to go into another room, they want to explore more, which is exactly what the school wants to have happen. I think the atrium isn't real, it's not just a single space. I'm probably going to connect this to back to the first question. It's not just a single space, it's made up of a combination of spaces intentionally. It's not a space where you take a stair from floor to floor and appreciate it as a whole space. It's a whole series of spaces that are connected vertically, kind of like a vertical main street. And while the vertical circulation, you can go up in the elevators, most people take the stairs for a floor or two. And the stairs are convenient enough that you can do that, but they're inconvenient enough. In other words, they're intentionally somewhat inconvenient, so you can't go from one stair directly to another. You have to walk on the floor to get to the start of the next stair, which is kind of a retail strategy. It gets you to walk by the products. This is the same thing, but here the product is interaction and other students and other faculty, and the idea is that it forces the interaction. And that was really the goal of the space. To go from class to class or from floor to floor, you have to go through the atrium. So it's extremely successful. Students want to be here. They don't want to leave. And frankly, it works too well, because we have students here from all over the university, and at times they actually squeeze the Annenberg students out. So the Annenberg students come here to go to class. The students from around the university come here on their own class schedule, so when the Annenberg students come out of their classes, there's no other spaces to sit in. So it's a great problem to have. And this atrium is really full of non-program space. It's not just a circulation space, it's a space filled with in-between spaces where you can, if you're in the middle of a conversation when you leave class, there's a place to sit down and talk, and there's a whiteboard handy, or there's a plug-in for your computer. So everything is very much there to encourage you to grow and interact and study and learn and all that. So it's very gratifying to see that happen. It happens every time I'm here. It seems like it's a 24-hour building almost. And I guess lastly, I'm quite proud of it as a piece of architecture. It's certainly the best interior I've ever done. It's not like anything I've done before, which I like a lot. And it gives me a lot of joy. I feel it's kind of a joyful space. and I think I see that same kind of appreciation in the users. And I also like that it's static, obviously, because people come and go and use it for different things, but also it changes during the year. There's sometimes during the summer when the sun is in the sky longer and it sets over this big open space called Cromwell Field to the northwest, and when the sun comes through the colored glass, this whole place gets transformed. White walls become yellow or orange or purple, and you get stripes on the floor and multi-hued colors, and then they move. It's quite activated visually. So for me, it's a joy to be here.
The opportunity was to design a family and children's chapel in the midst of a historic campus. The original church here is over 150 years old now. It's a very tradition-bound campus. There are ancient trees, ancient landscape, and so how do we build something that fits into that context but does it in a very new way and creates a new opportunity? So we really, in contrast to the original church, which is a kind of country Gothic church, very dark and long and inwardly focused, we wanted to do the reverse, to create something that was extroverted, that connected the interior to the landscape and the beautiful trees surrounding the site, and to make it inviting and accessible. And so that really shaped the space. Instead of a long and narrow shape, the floor plan is actually almost square, so that the plan naturally allows for flexibility and reorientation within the space in different directions depending on the seasons and the time of day. As a result, all walls are full of glass. There is a focal point for the altar, but for the most part, this space can be used in the round. There's glass, there are walls of glass in all directions. In fact, we designed it so that the walls fold back and there can be a direct indoor-outdoor connection on 3 sides of the space. So for me, great architecture works on many different levels. I would start with, let me start even earlier. I would start with understanding the institution and responding to the institution. So creating a place that expresses the nature of the society, the organization of the people it serves. I guess that's a very Kantian quality, which I've always admired and I've always found inspiring in architecture. Creating a sense of place, either by fitting in seamlessly or by contrasting in a challenging and inspiring way, gives you a sense of being in a very particular place in a very particular time. I think that's important. I don't think architecture is anonymous or neutral. Then there is the idea, which I think great architecture challenges us in some ways. It calls on us to do things a little differently. It pulls us out of ourselves. So the idea that architecture allows us to look at a familiar context differently. In the case of this chapel, we did the reverse of what the historic church did, which was inwardly focused. We opened this up and we made it very transparent and accessible. And we built in the possibility of using the space in different ways because it had an open, more flexible plan. And then there is the integrity of systems beautifully integrated to make a comfortable, working, accommodating space. So in this case, structure, mechanical systems, lighting, all very carefully and seamlessly integrated so that everything's in its place. There's a sense of unity in the space. The plaster columns that support a roof get expressed then in their connection to the roof with double beams, and the connections are all visible and articulated, and they're sometimes separated by bands of skylights that open up to the sky. All these things are done in an integrative way, which allows each system to complement and enhance the other. Then I would add to those qualities the idea of craft, the idea that there are thoughtful and complementary details, and that at a very detailed level you experience the quality of the space as well. So the way in which doors are made, the way in which the materials are selected and brought together and finished, all become part of the experience of great architecture.